This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Distler, here to kick off this week's episode. Today, Doug Harris, Director of the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice, joins Mike and David to introduce the AEFP Live Handbook of Education Policy Research, a new resource for evidence-based decision-making in schools. Then, on the Research Minute, Meredith shares new data from Massachusetts showing how the pandemic reshaped school enrollment, especially in middle grades and higher income districts. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now please join me in welcoming today's special guest, Doug Harris. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Mike, thanks for having me back.
This is the third time taping the intro because I keep butchering Doug's title and affiliations. But Doug, for those of you that somehow don't know, is the director of the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice, also known as REACH, also a professor at Tulane, and also the editor of the AEFP Live Handbook, which is what we're going to talk about today. First, let me welcome back from the south of France, my colleague, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Doug. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, great to have you back, David. Finally at full strength again. It's been a little while for us here in these summer months.
Yes, I know. It was a tough month in the south of France, but it's good to be back.
All right, good. Well, and Doug, you are there at Tulane in New Orleans, and I should say you all are getting ready for a big anniversary coming up, right? 20 years since Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, hard to believe. In August, it will have been 20 years, and we've been working on it for 14 years, trying to understand what's been happening here with the schools. So we just put out a report on that, and we'll have another anniversary event and try to have some good conversations about that here in New Orleans and nationally.
Yeah. Hard to believe. That does mean that I have now been back at Fordham for 20 years as well. So crazy. Time flies. All right. But we're not going to talk about all of that today. We are going to talk about this new resource that all of you should know about. And yet, no offense, Doug, but based on the fairly limited web hits so far, I guess a lot of you don't know about it, but we're going to change that here, Doug. This podcast alone is going to send so many people to this website. And it is the AEFP Live Handbook of Education Policy Research. And let's talk about that on Ed Reform Update. All right, so Doug, the first time I came across the old bound version of the AEFP handbook, I mean, it was random. I don't even know how I came across it, but I was like, oh my God, has this thing existed for a while? This is amazing. It was, and it still is, basically a place to go to see a super in-depth literature review on all the big topics in education, written by scholars, written to be fair and balanced in a meaningful way. And it was great, but it cost $1 bazillion, and you couldn't get it easily online. And so finally, it is now out on the web and in front of a paywall for all to access. Is that a fair way to describe what this is all about?
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And it was certainly part of the goal was to make it much more accessible and also kind of taking advantage of modern technology, not just in making it available, but also writing it and creating it in a way that was more useful.
Yeah. All right. Well, people should check it out. It is, like I say, a fantastic resource if you want to know all the research on charter schools. And you can go onto this website and you can dig in. And again, not a surface level. This is not, where you go for the one pager that you might hand to the governor, right? This is something where you really want to dig into the research over the course of, thousands of words, let's say, for a given topic, and get a good sense of what we know about a given topic. Now, Doug, this sort of thing, again, it's been around for a while, and let's just take some of the typical challenges that you think about it, right? There would be some who might say any endeavor like this, there's always going to be some bias. right? It's just like in let's say newspaper reporting. Those of us on the right would say, look, we just understand that there's often just a general sort of center left media bias out there. People may not recognize it, but for a variety of reasons, that's what you get. How do you worry that, let's say you're writing up or editing a piece on charter schools or teacher preparation or teacher evaluation or the many other topics you've got in here? I mean, how do you actually, with human beings, try to figure out how to call it straight down the middle, especially on these topics that are, very politically fraught?
Yeah. Well, let me go back to something you said a minute ago first, and that's the idea that it's really in depth and such, and it is. But I want to emphasize one thing, which is really it's written for policymakers and practitioners first, like that, and journalists. That those are the primary audiences. So what we do at the beginning is you could think about the first couple of pages is actually being the one pager or the two pager policy brief. So if you're looking for something brief, it really boils it down to here are 5 or 6 key conclusions. Here's what we know in one paragraph. Here's the key debates. And if that's all you want, like that's there too. But that's the advantage of the technology is if you just keep scrolling or if you just want to click and you want more detail on the conclusion, if you want that detail, you can get it too by scrolling down. And if you want even more detail and you want the endnotes and the publication, like you can get that too. So I just want to make sure it's clear that this is who it's written for and how it's designed to serve those different purposes. So now, to your question was really about what I would call the objectivity question, or how do we deal with bias? And it's certainly true. We're all human, and everybody is subject to bias. So the way we approach that, first of all, is to try to ask the authors, the people who are writing this, to describe right from the beginning what the debate's about. Like almost every topic has there's this side and there's that side and there's a third side, and let's just talk about what the primary issues are that are discussed. And then to frame the rest of the piece in terms of the evidence that pertains to that debate. So right from the beginning, if you approached it that way, you're forced to take on or to consider different sides of the issue. And somebody might come down on one side and say, well, actually, the concerns that this group was worried about, those turn out not to be very important in the data. That could be. And some people might interpret the evidence differently, but we have an editorial board that's also meant to step in to deal with situations like that. The editorial board is also quite wide-ranging. People who are seen as being more on the right, people who are seen as being more on the left, and also different disciplines. So some people are more quantitative, some people are more qualitative, some people, sociologists, economists, psychologists. We got the whole gamut of people in there, and so there's sort of a built-in mechanism for making sure that we're handling the debate and handling the evidence in a balanced way.
Yeah. And how do you think about evidence? What counts? This is, again, a project of people who are scholars, you're academics. So I assume that there is a certain amount of credentialing that goes into this, right?
Sure. Part of it depends on what the conclusion is. So some conclusions are descriptive conclusions. Sometimes it's just, charter schools tend to locate more in urban areas or something like that. That doesn't require as much sophistication. It's not a causal question. It's just describing the reality. For causal questions, where we're looking at the effect of some policy on student outcomes or some other outcome, that's when we hit the standards and expect people to set a high bar and requiring either an experiment or a quasi-experiment where we have convincing evidence that the relationship is actually representing a causal effect. So I think,
And peer review journals, is that a requirement or not necessarily? Asks the think tank that produces its own studies several times a year.
Not necessarily. No, I think especially if you want to be timely in terms of the studies that you're talking about, it can take a while for studies to get into journals. And it's also, there are some journals that you can get into that, where the evidence really is not that great. So we totally recognize, peer review is definitely important and something we definitely prioritize. And in fact, the whole project, the whole Life Handbook is peer reviewed, right? The authors have the editors giving them feedback. That's a peer review process by itself. So that's important, but it's not the only thing. And we're relying on the judgment of the editors and picking the authors who are going to do a good job of judging, what's good evidence or not, and then relying on the authors themselves to make that judgment on their own.
Yeah. So it seems like one benefit of something like this that's now online rather than a published volume that again was a huge tome, right? It could only come out once a year or once every few years. Is that as soon as a new study comes out and it's high quality, it could be incorporated into the write-up. Right.
Yeah.
Or you could also get feedback from lots of people who maybe say, I read this. I thought it was really thoughtful. I thought it was mostly right. But on this one point, I think you're overlooking X, Y, and Z. So is that something that you can do, that this can continue to grow, that this can be something that's maybe more interactive or evolves quicker than what you usually get in the
Yeah,
past?
exactly. That's also part of the point. So the way I to think about this whole thing is it's a cross between the old, printed tomes of the printed handbooks and Wikipedia, right? So with Wikipedia, you don't have the element of authorship and necessarily expertise that's going into it. So we're marrying those two things. We're having an author work on it, but the authors are expected to update them. Like that was part of the deal right from the beginning. We explained that this is how it was going to work. Very unusual setup. It took a while for people to understand, how this is actually going to work. But we're going to have a process once a year where everybody's expected to go back and reread their pieces. We have a feedback mechanism in the website where people can go in and provide that into a system that then will provide the feedback. The system will give it to the authors as part of that annual process to ask them to review the feedback that they've received. A lot of feedback's actually coming in as we're learning just by emails. People are like, I've gotten an email on my charter school piece, and people are then directly contacting the authors rather than going through the system, which is fine too. But the key is to get that responsiveness in there. And like you said, if there's some new important study, we don't even have to wait a year on that. People can update them whenever they want. But we have the formal process once a year to make sure that everybody's looking at what they're writing on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
All right, good. Again, it's livehandbook.org. And I'll just read some of the topics here just so people know. You got school boards, charter schools, interdistrict and interdistrict open enrollment, vouchers and ESAs, academic standards, grading policies, school district takeovers, teacher licensure, teacher compensation, administrator mobility, equity and adequacy in terms of resources. I mean, on and on. Wow, even a COVID and schools section. I mean, again, these are topics that are fraught. David, I don't know if you've had a chance to dig into this yet, but as a newly minted PhD yourself, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well,
Did
it's
you like
either
how I got that in there, David? I know I said I was going to stop bringing it up, but David just
I
got
heard. Yeah, I heard.
hooded
Congratulations.
not too long ago, so we're still celebrating.
okay. Well, it's either the sanest thing anyone's ever done or it's evidence of insanity. I guess my question is, are you confident that you have wrapped your head around all the topics? Did you have to make some choices about what to leave on the side? To me, that's almost the craziest part of this, right? Is saying, these are all the topics that matter. I know that's not the tone in which you said it, but that is kind of what you're shooting for, right? Is to be comprehensive,
Right.
which seems crazy. So, I mean, is there anything that's not there that you've let go by the wayside? How do you think about sort of emerging
Yeah.
topics?
Yeah. Certainly, it's not comprehensive yet. That's an aspiration. Yeah, we've got 50 or so chapters in there right now. The goal is to update the existing 50 and then add another 30 or so each year. So that it keeps growing over time. Certainly, there's a lot on the cutting room floor that we have a spreadsheet where we started off with just a brain dump of all the possible things, and then started to organize it. And then the editors would come in and say, I ask everybody, pick 2 or 3 that you want to be the editor for, then go find authors to go write them, and that's how we ended up with the 50. So it was kind of organic, and letting the editorial board. I mean, it's a spectacular group. So just looking at the editorial board, that was the one of the most important things to do at the beginning, was to get that group, and then we can add another 30 just from a bandwidth standpoint, adding about 30 or so we think we can do while also updating the other one. So it is a little bit insane. I think that was kind of the reaction I got when I first started asking people about this and asking them to join. They thought I was a little nuts, but I think it turned out, I think at least as good, maybe better than what we had hoped, and I think everybody's excited about it.
It's ambitious, and it's not just K-12, it's early childhood and higher ed as well.
That's right.
So let me turn this, Doug, to a related question, which, as you know, our colleague Amber of Amber's Research Minute is over at the Department of Education right now, coming up with a plan to reboot the Institute for Educational Sciences. And one big thing that we need that people are going to have to figure out is, what do you do with the What Works Clearinghouse? And it strikes me that you have built something that some people could see as a better version of the What Works Clearinghouse, at least when it comes to policy, right? There's sorts of things that states and in some cases local school boards care about, right? It doesn't cover everything. You're not, for example, evaluating math curriculum. But if you're a governor or somebody who works for a governor, the state school board, the state legislator, state superintendent, and even in some cases, local school boards on some questions, this is super helpful. And so I kind of think, man, maybe this is better for you, a group of academics doing this, than to try to have the federal government in its bureaucratic, clumsy way try to do it. What do you think about that?
So that was not the goal, and I don't think it should be the goal. So I think the What Works Clearinghouse has potential. It certainly has its pitfalls, but there's some things that it does that can really, I think, only be within a framework, within the government and separate from what we're doing. So you mentioned one this difference already, which is we're more focused on policy. They're more focused on practice and more in the classroom type things than what we are. And another part of it is that a lot of what the schools are expected to respond to and to do is rooted in legislation about tiers of evidence. And I think you need a formal process. You need a full panel to establish tiers of evidence if you're going to legally require the schools to adopt things from a menu of options. Then I think you have to go through as bureaucratic as it might be. I think you need to go through the kind of process, maybe better, faster version of what the What Works Clearinghouse is doing. But I still think you would need that kind of a process, and we can't replace that with what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think they're complementary, though. I think people refer to what the What Works Clearinghouse does, and even looks to the kinds of studies they're citing in the process of writing the live handbook chapter. So I think that they can be useful to each other, and that could go in the other direction too, where people working in the What Works Clearinghouse might kind of start off by referring to something that we have where there's overlap in the topic.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And look, and for those of us who work in policy, think tanks, you have not put us out of work either, I would say, right? Because when you read these reviews, like the charter school one, for example, a lot of great information on the evidence on, are charter schools higher performing than traditional public schools, and in which settings, and, what are the impact competitive effects? I didn't see anywhere where it said, and therefore, here's what your charter school laws should look like. These
Correct.
are the exact, you want to set up your authorizer like this, and you want to set up the funding system like that, right? I mean, there's still a lot to fill in terms of going from here's a bunch of studies on a topic to what does this actually mean for state policy in a given.
Yeah, there are always value judgments and involved in these decisions. So that's why we're pretty vigilant in the editing process about editing those out. There are a few that came in with statements like the ones you described, and we said, no, that's not what we're doing here.
Yeah. Now, one of the criticisms of the What Works Clearinghouse has always been that, hey, there's some good stuff up there, and especially the What Works practice guides were some really nice syntheses of here's, early math, what you might think about doing, but nobody knew about them, right?
Yeah.
You would do surveys, and teachers and principals and even maybe chief academic officers were like, wait, what? I've never come across that,
Yeah.
which seems crazy. I mean, we have this tool. It's not that new. It's called Google, and it's called the internet, right? And now we have these chatbots, or we have even on something like Google, we have these AI-generated answers. So you would think that if we're doing this right, if somebody goes in and is actually looking for evidence, they're looking for suggestions, they're, let's say a policy staffer in the state role who is like, okay, I do want to know, my governor wants to do something on innovative teacher compensation. And so let me get my head around what we know about that topic. They should be able to come in and plug something into their search engine or their, now favorite AI chatbot and find you. And I guess the question is, how do we make that happen? Is there some way and in the same way that we will want them to maybe find what works clearinghouse stuff if they're trying to figure out what math curriculum they should buy?
Yeah. The hope is that we'll get journalists to use it to write their stories, and so if they link to it, then it's going to pop up earlier when think tanks like Fordham Institute are writing pieces on related topics. The more everybody links to it, the more others will find it. So I think that's part of the logic. We're also starting a social media strategy, not my strong suit, but bringing in people to raise awareness of it, and we've got a lot of people involved. So there are more than 100 people. Between the authors, the editorial board. We also have the board of policymakers and practitioners, which thank you for participating and to help design this and help to shepherd it forward. So there are a lot of folks who have an interest in it and want to see it succeed, and so getting them involved and making making the authors' individual pieces widely available and engaging in the conversations and the debates and trying to pull the evidence into those debates. Those are all the kinds of things that will be helpful. Hopefully your listeners will look it up, and hopefully as they're listening now, they're pulling out their phones and toggling through it and looking for things that will be useful to them, that they might also cite. Researchers hopefully will then cite it as well in their articles. So
yes. All right. So everybody go right now, livehandbook.org. Check it out. It really is an incredible menu of topics that you can dig into. Very nicely done, very clean and useful. And again, if you're looking for evidence, if you're writing a literature review, if you're trying to get your head around something in education policy, this is an excellent place to start.
Mike, can I mention one other thing that hasn't come up?
Please.
So far?
Yeah.
So the other thing that we invited and encourage authors to do is to talk about what we don't know. Right? And that's something that often gets left out of these conversations. So there are lots of questions and topics where people come and say, well, what do we know about this? And the answer is really, we don't know. The evidence isn't very good on this topic. And so we've really pushed authors to even make that a part of the conversation. Usually we shy away from saying what we don't know as researchers. That's our instinct. But in some ways, what policymakers, practitioners, journalists need to know is what we don't know, and so that they're not making overconfident conclusions and so on. So that's another key feature.
Yeah. No, and that gives those of us that do produce studies and other scholars around the country, young scholars, everybody, a chance to look at that and say, hey,
yep,
maybe I could do a study on X,
exactly.
Y, and Z because it's a topic that where we don't have enough information.
Yep.
All right. Well, Doug, thank you so much for coming on the show. Again, Doug Harris from Tulane University and the editor of the Live Handbook. Check it out, livehandbook.org. I feel like I'm, on TV trying to sell bracelets or something here. But hopefully
it's more useful than bracelets.
Hopefully we got some people interested. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, David.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Adams Research Minute. Meredith, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've got Meredith filling in for Adam, who's been filling in for Amber on the Research Minute. But you have done this before. It's been a little while, but we're glad to have you back. And I should say, I was welcoming David back from the south of France, which sounds very exciting. But I understand that you got to go to the Sesame Street amusement park. I'm going to forget what it's called. What is it called again?
I did. It is Sesame Place, not the south of France, but it is the southeast of Pennsylvania. So there is that. No, but it's great. It's great if you have close relatives in the preschool, even elementary school age sets. It's a great destination. Would recommend. Much more manageable than like a Disney World, Disneyland type of experience.
Gotcha. More manageable. We found Legoland in that phase of life to be a big hit as well. One time I was speaking at Disney World and we ditched Disney World to go see Legoland. And that was a good decision. My children never got to go to Disney as children. And that was a goal of mine, was to keep them away. from that mouse, and I succeeded. So there you go. Oh, well, I should say, they're 15 and 17, so maybe it could still catch up with us. But I think we're in the clear.
It's just weird. That's one of my life goals too. But well done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Again, no offense, people out there. I'm going to hear hate mail from Disney fans. I'm sure it's wonderful. I just didn't want it. It wasn't for me. Wasn't for me.
As a native Floridian, I have to speak up on behalf of the mouse. But Sesame Place, Legoland, they have their qualities too.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Enough with that. What do you have for us on the research minute front, Meredith?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the introduction. So today we're looking at a study from Massachusetts from Boston University researchers Joshua Goodman and Abigail Francis. And the study is about the pandemic's long-term, or at this point, still kind of medium-term impact on school enrollment. So we're all well aware that public school enrollment dropped during the height of the pandemic and remote learning. But now that everyone's been back to in-person learning for a while, have kids come back to public schools? And if so, which kids have come back? And if they haven't come back, then where are they? So that's where this study comes in. And what's exciting is that it has the most up-to-date data going up through this most recent school year. So we're still only about the fourth school year out from remote or hybrid learning, which in many places, including Massachusetts, lasted through 2021. So even one more year of data makes a difference in adding to the picture. And before I jump into the study, I'll also note that Massachusetts has not seen a lot of the dramatic post-pandemic changes in terms of vouchers, ESAs, and a lot of those other school choice policies that have taken hold elsewhere. So most of the enrollment changes we see in this study are unlikely to be related to expanded school choice. So the researchers used two data sets from the state to cover all children enrolled in Massachusetts schools, including even homeschools. And they created a linear model based on enrollment data from fall 2016 to fall 2019 to predict what 2020 to 2024 enrollment would have looked like had it not been for the pandemic. And I acknowledge that's a little bit along the lines of, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? But it's still probably going to be the best available way to create a counterfactual to compare the actual post-pandemic enrollment to. So then the researchers compare what actually happened, the real enrollment data, to that counterfactual, what enrollment would have looked like had it continued in a line along the same trajectory as it was on before the pandemic. And so for some context, prior to 2020 in Massachusetts, traditional public school enrollment and private school enrollment had been declining. On the other hand, charter school enrollment was rapidly rising and homeschool enrollment was flat and also just very low. So what did the researchers find? Well, first, overall, fall 2024 enrollment in traditional public schools is about 2% lower than would have been predicted, even with that pre-existing downward trend accounted for. That means Massachusetts probably lost almost 17,000 public school students. Charter enrollment is also lower than the counterfactual, coming in at almost 19% lower. However, what happened there was that enrollment had been skyrocketing in the 2010s and then suddenly plateaued at 2020. So that actually may have a lot to do with 2010 legislation that expanded charters and then charter caps being reached later in that decade. On the flip side, both private and homeschool enrollments now exceed predicted levels. So private school enrollment, again, had been declining, but then it plateaued in 2020. That puts it almost 14% above the counterfactual. Homeschool enrollment shot up during the pandemic and then decreased a little, but it still remains almost 45% higher than would have been expected. So that's by sector. And then what does the study tell us about trends within traditional public school enrollment? Well, geographically, the largest declines were in the suburban districts immediately outside Boston. Districts farther from Boston actually saw some growth compared to pre-pandemic trends. And in terms of wealth disparities, traditional public school enrollment dropped across all socioeconomic groups, but the losses were much larger for the highest income districts. And that's those in the top quintile of income. Those districts lost almost 6%, whereas the other four quintiles dropped in enrollment to only 1% below counterfactual. But one of the biggest differences in enrollment changes has to do with race. So both white and Asian student enrollment declined compared to pre-pandemic trends. White student enrollment had already been declining, but then it dropped even further, coming in at 5% below predicted enrollment. Asian students' enrollment had actually been on the rise, but post-pandemic, it dropped pretty sharply to come in at 8% below the counterfactual. But on the other hand, Hispanic and especially Black students' enrollment has actually exceeded predictions. Hispanic students' enrollment is just a little higher than the counterfactual, not quite 1%, but Black students' enrollment is almost 8% above the predicted level. So this contrast between declining white and Asian students' enrollment versus rising Hispanic and Black students' enrollment, that means Massachusetts schools are undergoing a major demographic shift that at this point may well stick around. All right, I know that was a lot. Bear with me for one final breakdown of public school enrollment trends, and that's by grade level. Pre-K through fourth grade enrollment has basically bounced back, landing even a little higher than predicted overall. And on the other end of the grade level spectrum, high school enrollment has stayed pretty close to the predicted trend line. Middle school enrollment, however, is where we see a huge difference. Enrollment in 5th through 8th grades is now almost 8% below predicted levels. That comes out to nearly 21,000 students. Now, census data do suggest that migration patterns could be part of the story here, but it seems likely that that doesn't explain everything. And as one final note, the researchers compared the patterns in Massachusetts to those nationwide and found pretty similar. Overall, traditional public school enrollment, as well as disparities related to race and that huge drop in the middle grades, those were all pretty consistent with national trends.
Whew, that is a lot. And I'm glad you added that piece on national. That was going to be one of my big questions, was whether we thought Massachusetts was similar. Of course, it is not similar in that it does not, as you say, it has not expanded school choice recently, like at least a bunch of the red states have, either private school choice or the charter school thing, right? They've got this hard cap on charter schools, and that is unlike at least a bunch of other states. But look, some of these shifts are really interesting. And I think the middle school thing is really interesting. And it makes me wonder if it's a middle school thing or if it's a COVID generation thing, right? I mean, these were kids who were like, what, kindergarten, first, second grade during Zoom school, and probably were hurt the most of anybody in this experiment we had in trying to do online learning during the pandemic. And so, you could imagine a whole bunch of them didn't learn to read, or, really struggling, maybe behavioral stuff. And for parents with the means who are disproportionately white and Asian and live in those affluent areas, they decide to take them out, to homeschool them, or to send them to private schools. I mean, that story makes sense to me. David, what do you think?
Yeah, well, so correct me if I'm wrong. The timing doesn't, it's not as though they just didn't board the bus, the public school bus, right? Like the timing doesn't quite line up for that, right? We're also seeing kids in like 8th grade who had to have been in school when COVID started, and we're still seeing big declines in those grades, right? I mean, to me, that points towards the middle school hypothesis, I think, although I kind of want more information. I guess
as opposed to my COVID generation hypothesis.
Well, I mean, all these, generations didn't do well, right? I mean, to me, it makes more sense. Where my head went was that maybe there's some sort of stickiness, right, to their behavior. You chose not to go to a traditional public school, during COVID, and so then therefore you never went to one, right? But it doesn't sound like that's quite the way the timing lines up. So I don't know. I'm sort of looking on the other side of it, which is, as I understand it, it's like a lot of these kids are homeschooled, right? And so maybe it's just really hard to homeschool your kid in full IB, or it's challenging to hold down a part-time job or any kind of job and homeschool a second grader or a kindergartner. I'm speculating here, but I found the middle school thing to be the most intriguing and the hardest to explain.
Yeah, and the increase in Black enrollment is also surprising. I mean, I don't know exactly how to how to make sense of that, right? Unless, are they leaving private schools? Is this migration from other places? I mean, I don't know. Who knows? I mean,
models aren't perfect, Mike. I mean, that's all I'll say. I'm not sort of casting doubt on the researchers' methods, but they are estimates at the end of the day. Like we can't take it too literally. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on there, but that was my reaction to it.
Yeah.
I think
And
the
Meredith,
stuff around Asians is really interesting though, right?
yeah.
I mean, this notion that they just kind of abandoned. I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm sure your head went the same place that mine did, which is there was one group that did really well during the pandemic, somehow, contrary to essentially all, logic and reason. And it was Asian kids. And they basically came out stronger than ever. It's at least the numbers I've seen suggest that they were essentially unscathed. And it just makes me wonder, right, if there isn't a non-trivial subset of Asian parents that either decided they could do it better themselves or decided they weren't satisfied with their traditional public schools. I feel like this narrative is overplayed in general. Like reformers say, oh, parents have, they've rejected traditional public schools. And yet here we see that 98% of them are returning to traditional public schools. But I feel like maybe for this subgroup, there's something to it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that could be. And look, we've talked on the show before about this question about the homeschooling piece. There were some huge numbers during the pandemic and right after the pandemic in terms of people reporting that they were homeschooling. And I was always wondering, like, well, that's confusing. I mean, if your kid is literally at home, during COVID, are you now homeschooling? Well, probably us wonks think, well, no, if you're still enrolled in your public schools and you're just doing it over Zoom, that's not homeschooling. All right, now it's been several years, but clearly, there's some big chunk of kids who started homeschooling during the pandemic and did not go back. And however, when you look at the younger grades, the fact that the elementary schools, the traditional public schools have recovered more in those elementary grades, that's interesting. That seems to be that maybe that group is going back down closer to the pre-COVID version of this, which is my argument. I guess I would say is that it's always going to be, at least for as far as I can tell, and for right now, it's still a niche. It's so hard. I mean, it's so hard about, David was talking about how hard it is to parent, in the south of France with a 3-year-old. I mean, try homeschooling, 24/7, 365. I mean, this has just got to be a tough thing that there's a limited number of parents who are going to sign up for. It's a bigger group than maybe before, but it's, maybe it is starting to revert back as we look at people whose kids are, kindergarten and making this choice for the first time.
Yeah, Mike, and I think reactions are probably going to, sort of normative reactions are going to vary to these numbers, right? Of course, but personally, I will say I was modestly encouraged by the profile of kids that seem to be leaving, because I tend to worry more personally about kids leaving the system for options that really aren't good, or that they aren't prepared for, right? Like I have some pretty significant concerns about the way homeschooling's traditionally been done in this country, and sort of the lack of any sort of floor that's put underneath it for just families that may not understand what they're tackling, right? But when you look at these numbers, right, that those the kids who are leaving the system are kids, they're families with means, right? These are, I forget exactly what the numbers were, but they're it's from the very sort of toniest districts in Massachusetts, for crying out loud. I don't actually think we have to worry that much about these kids, right? Like these are families that are well equipped to take advantage of school choice. They probably know what they're doing. Even if they don't, they probably have the means to address the problem after a year or two. And so I know that there's some people who are going to look at this and say, well, the sort of richest and wealthiest families are exiting the system here. But personally, that just wasn't my reaction, right? I think that this is a fairly safe example of school choice that shouldn't really worry anyone that much.
Okay, we will leave it there. Meredith, thank you. Really interesting stuff. Well, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.
Bye.